Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The thing they don't tell you about wedding rehearsals is that they can feel more like dress rehearsals for a breakdown than a celebration. I'd always imagined mine would be simple, white chairs on the lawn, some out-of-tune laughter, someone's toddler picking flower petals off a centerpiece, the usual chaos with a romantic edge. Instead, I found myself gripping the back of a pew like it was a lifeline, watching my future mother-in-law glide in like a politician at a funeral, all fake smiles, and that perfume she wore like a threat. Dan stood beside me, handsome as hell in his navy jacket, smiling that boyish smile that still got to me even after 3 years together. He looked at me like I was the only person in the world. But that look? It was getting harder to trust. I'd met Eleanor exactly 6 times before that day, and every time, she greeted me like she was being handed a traffic ticket. She never said anything outright mean, she was smarter than that, but every comment came with a bite hidden under sugar. Like when she told me she loved how I dressed so casually, even in photos, or that not every woman needs to be a natural beauty to be lovable. It was always said with a warm voice, and always followed by a sip of something expensive and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I should have seen it earlier, the shark teeth behind the pearls. We were lining up for the processional, everyone joking around about who would trip on the runner or who had the worst posture, and Eleanor stepped next to me like she was sliding into a trap she set herself. She didn't look at me directly, of course not. She kept her eyes forward, like we were both just actresses in some twisted play she'd been directing from behind the scenes since day one. And then, without even turning her head, she leaned slightly in and whispered under her breath, "Enjoy this while it lasts. He'll regret choosing you." Just like that. Like she was commenting on the weather. I froze, not visibly, not in a way anyone could clock. But inside, my entire spine went cold. Now, here's the thing, I've had people dislike me before. I'm not naive. But something about this woman, this calculating queen of subtle cruelty, made it hit differently. She didn't just think I wasn't good enough for Dan. She thought I was disposable. Replaceable. A placeholder until he came to his senses. And the worst part? She believed it with the certainty of someone who had never been told she was wrong in her entire life. I didn't say a word back to her. Not then. I stood there with my bouquet of fake rehearsal flowers and smiled like I didn't hear it. I laughed at the joke Dan's best man told about in-laws and pretended I didn't want to hurl the whole floral arrangement down the aisle like a javelin. Because here's what she didn't know what none of them knew. I'd spent my entire life dealing with people like her. People who smile while they poison the well. People who think silence means surrender. Dan didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and didn't know what to say. He has that way about him, gentle, conflict avoidant, more peacekeeper than warrior. That's part of why I love him. But it's also the thing that scares me. Because a man who can't stand up to his mother might never stand up for his wife. The rehearsal moved on. We practiced the vows, the kiss, the awkward walk back down the aisle while everyone clapped like trained seals. Eleanor even clapped, dainty and polite. And when Dan took my hand and whispered, "This is really happening," I smiled and said, "Yeah, it is." But my eyes were already on her. On the woman who thought she could corner me in my own wedding and win. On the woman who thought words like hers would be forgotten, ignored, swallowed down like bad wine at a cheap reception. She didn't know me at all. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me like some slow hypnotist. Dan was passed out beside me, exhausted from family small talk and wine and whatever men think about the night before they commit to forever. I thought about how many times she'd done this. Not just to me, but probably to anyone who threatened her little empire. Dan's ex, Marissa, I'd never met her, but Eleanor mentioned her enough to make her feel like a shadow living in our relationship. Marissa always made the best apple pie, she once said at Thanksgiving, like I'd brought a tray of wet cardboard instead of pumpkin crumble. She really had a gift for keeping things elegant. Marissa spoke French, taught yoga, volunteered with underprivileged kids, and probably cured cancer in her spare time if you listened to Eleanor long enough. But here I was, the one Dan chose. And maybe that made her furious in a way even she couldn't explain. Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed, padded barefoot across the carpet, and sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook and a pen. I didn't know what I was going to write yet. I just knew I needed to get something down. Some piece of myself that wouldn't disappear under Eleanor's smirks and sideways comments. I thought about what she said, "He'll regret choosing you," and something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just smiled. Because if she wanted a war, I wasn't going to bring a knife to it. I was going to bring words. And the first draft of my wedding vow started with, "To the woman who taught me the true meaning of restraint." I smiled as I wrote it. She smiled like a shark. But I'd learned how to smile like one too. If I had $1 for every time Eleanor made me question my sanity with a smile, I'd have enough to buy her mansion and rent it out to rescue dogs just to spite her. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, like her words were dipped in sugar but still managed to cut through bone. Long before the wedding rehearsal whisper that lit the match, there were smaller fires she'd set, tiny matches she struck and flicked toward my dignity whenever she felt like amusing herself. And somehow, she always made it look accidental, like she was just saying what was on her mind. But let me tell you, that woman's mind was a carefully curated museum of passive aggression. The first time I met her, Dan had only been dating me for about 4 months. He was eager, proud, totally smitten in the way that made you feel like maybe all the crap relationships before him had been worth it. He brought me to her house in Westchester, this fortress of gray stone and white furniture that screamed, "Don't touch anything." I walked in wearing this yellow sundress I loved, and before I could even introduce myself properly, she looked me up and down and said, "Cassie? That's short for Cassandra, I assume? Or is it one of those modern names?" And then came the kicker, she chuckled and said, "Cassie sounds like, I don't know, a stage name. Like you'd be spinning around a pole somewhere in Vegas." Dan laughed. I still remember that. He laughed, then looked at me to see if I'd laugh too. And I did. God help me, I actually laughed because I didn't want to seem uptight or sensitive. I told myself she was just joking, that maybe it was a generational thing. But inside, something hard and sharp started to take shape. It only got worse from there. She didn't care about my job, graphic designer for a tech startup, because in her world, if you didn't have a master's degree and a country club membership, you were playing house. She'd ask me things like, "So, are you still doing that little art thing?" Or, "That's great you get to work on your computer all day. Must be like a hobby." Every word had a timer on it, slowly ticking toward detonation. Then there was the Marissa situation. I'd never met her, never even seen a photo, but somehow this woman haunted every corner of my relationship like some goddamn exorcism that never got completed. Eleanor talked about her like she was royalty. Marissa spoke fluent French and volunteered at the Children's Hospital every weekend. She was incredibly elegant. And her apple pie? I mean, it made Martha Stewart look like a fraud. She'd sigh when she said her name, like she was remembering a dead daughter instead of her son's ex-girlfriend. By the time the rehearsal dinner came around, I'd already had my fill. I told myself I'd rise above, be gracious, be the bigger person, all that garbage people say when they want you to swallow your anger and pretend it's grace. But then I had the bright idea of baking something for the dinner, because, maybe if I tried a little harder, she'd meet me halfway. So I made cupcakes. Vanilla bean with lemon frosting, decorated with little sugared violets I bought from a baking boutique that charged way too much for flowers you're supposed to eat. I arranged them carefully on 3 trays, 6 on each, making exactly 24 cupcakes, which, fun fact, is 36 if you do the math like an idiot. Anyway, I remember there were exactly 24 cupcakes, 6 in each of the 3 trays, which made 36, obviously. I placed them on the table with a little sign that said, "Made with love," and I waited. Guests trickled in. People smiled. Dan kissed my cheek and said they looked amazing. Then Eleanor arrived. Late, of course. She always made an entrance like the queen of some forgotten country. She picked up one of the cupcakes, turned it in her fingers like she was inspecting a suspicious artifact, and took a tiny bite. She paused, made this theatrical little frown, and said loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear, "Did you mistake salt for sugar again?" She let the cupcake fall back on the plate like it had insulted her ancestors. Someone laughed. Someone else coughed awkwardly. Dan froze. That's what he does when she goes off script. He freezes like a deer watching a car barrel down the highway. He put his arm around me like that would fix anything, like a little squeeze could glue together the crack she'd just sliced across the table. I smiled. I nodded. I acted like it was nothing, just like I always did. But inside, that sharp thing inside me twisted a little deeper. Because it wasn't just the insult, it was the way she said again, like she'd been keeping track of every misstep, every failed recipe, every stumble I'd ever made in front of her. Like I was some clumsy intern in her life's kitchen, burning everything I touched while she took notes. That night, after the guests had left and the plates had been cleared, I sat on the edge of the guest bed at Dan's parents' house and stared at my hands. They still smelled like lemon frosting. I thought about how easy it would be to say something back next time, to stop letting her take shots without consequence. But then I remembered something she'd once said when I asked her how she stayed so composed. Words, she told me, are more powerful when you don't waste them. Fine. I wouldn't waste them. I'd sharpen them instead. That's when I started journaling everything she said. Not just the big insults, but the little ones too. The pauses, the smirks, the backhanded compliments. I wrote them down like a war correspondent tracking enemy movements. And a week later, I bought a tiny voice recorder, fit in my clutch perfectly, picked up every word within 10 feet. It wasn't paranoia if she kept proving me right. If Eleanor wanted a war of words, she picked the wrong woman. Because I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to know the exact moment to let my voice land. And something told me that moment was getting closer. There are moments when you find something that changes the way you look at a person you thought you knew, and not in a dramatic, cinematic way with music swelling in the background, but in a slow, sinking stomach kind of way. Like realizing too late that you've stepped into quicksand and that it's rising past your knees while the person standing on solid ground just watches. That's what it felt like the afternoon I opened Dan's closet looking for an old sweater I'd left at his place, and instead found a thick, leather-bound photo album tucked behind a stack of worn flannel shirts and college yearbooks, like something purposely buried yet not quite hidden. I should have left it alone, I know that, but when something's deliberately placed out of view, it makes you feel like it's holding a secret, and I guess some part of me already suspected what I'd find. The cover was cracked, the leather soft from years of handling, and when I opened it, the smell of old paper and faint perfume hit me like a memory I didn't own. The first page was a photo of Eleanor and Dan, arms around each other at some lakeside cabin, smiling like people in a picture frame at a department store. The next page was the same cabin, but with another woman in the frame, tall, brunette, absurdly polished, wearing a cream sweater that looked like it cost more than my car payment. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were locked on Dan like he was the only thing worth looking at. I kept turning the pages, and there she was, again and again, at family holidays, barbecues, vacations. Marissa. Every single photo had her in it, every single moment captured as if she'd been adopted into the family by blood instead of love. And here's the kicker, not one photo of me. Not a single shot, not even from the holidays I'd spent in that same house, sitting at that same table, trying not to roll my eyes at Eleanor's constant mentions of how lovely things used to be. That album was a shrine to a relationship that had ended 2 years before Dan and I even met, and yet it was sitting there like a family Bible, proof that someone else had once been approved, sanctified, and declared worthy. I remember shutting the album slowly, like slamming it would make me feel too petty. My hands were trembling just enough to make the edges of the leather feel like sandpaper. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I waited until that evening after dinner when we were curled up on the couch watching some crime drama we both liked, and I turned to him and asked as casually as I could manage, "Why do you still have a photo album full of Marissa in your closet?" He blinked like I'd just asked him if he believed in aliens and then shrugged, the kind of shrug that meant this wasn't going to go the way I wanted. "She was around a lot," he said, like that explained anything, like that justified keeping a curated visual history of his mother's favorite almost daughter-in-law while his actual fiancé didn't exist in the archives. "My mom's the one who made it anyway. I guess she's just used to her. She'll come around. She'll come around." Those 3 words stuck in my head for days. Not just because they felt like a slap in the face, but because they implied that it was my job to wait, to behave, to endure until Eleanor deemed me acceptable enough to earn a spot on a dusty photo album shelf. And if I didn't? Then what? Did I get erased too? It was a few days later, when I was home alone and scrolling through old voicemails while trying to find one from my aunt about the florist, that I heard it. A message left not for me, but clearly left on my phone by accident. I recognized Eleanor's voice immediately, smooth, deliberate, dripping with fake kindness. She was talking to someone, and within 10 seconds, it became clear exactly who. "Don't worry, sweetie," she said, with that rehearsed softness she reserved for those she truly loved. "It won't last long. He'll come back to his senses. He always does. She's just a phase." A phase. That's what I was. A temporary detour. A test drive. I didn't tell Dan. I didn't even ask him if he knew they were still talking, because I didn't need him to lie to me, not yet. I needed to stay clear-headed, focused. Because if this woman wanted to play dirty, I could match her move for move, word for word. And that's when I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't need to scream, or cry, or demand anything. I just needed one moment. One line. One stage. The next morning, I drove to the church and asked to speak with Father Andrew, who was as gentle and grandfatherly as priests come, with the kind of soft patience that makes you spill your guts before you even mean to. I told him I wanted to make a small change to my vows. Just a few words, I said, smiling in a way that must have made him suspicious, because he raised one eyebrow and leaned forward slightly, like he was reading more between the lines than I gave him credit for. "Is this something you want him to hear?" he asked gently, meaning Dan, probably, and I nodded, but my mind was somewhere else. "No," I said, "this is something I want her to hear." He blinked at me for a long second, then opened his little notepad and waited. "I want you to read it out loud during the ceremony," I said. "Exactly as I write it. No edits." He glanced down at the paper, read the first line, then looked back at me slowly. There was something between concern and curiosity in his expression, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something that almost resembled peace. "Are you sure," he asked carefully, "you want me to read this out loud?" And I just smiled, because I had never been more sure of anything in my life. The thing about wedding mornings is that everyone talks about nerves, about cold feet and excited jitters, about the quiet panic that settles in your gut when the reality of forever starts breathing down your neck. But what I felt when I opened my eyes that morning wasn't nerves, and it sure as hell wasn't panic. It was adrenaline, pure, hot, rolling through my veins like gasoline waiting for a spark. I woke up before the sun even had the decency to peek over the horizon, sat on the edge of the hotel bed, and stared at the floor like it had answers. My dress hung on the back of the door like a ghost with good posture, and the silence in the room felt sharp, like something was about to happen that couldn't be undone. My bridesmaids were still asleep in the other room, sprawled out with half-empty champagne flutes and false eyelashes stuck to their cheeks like fallen feathers. I padded barefoot across the carpet, made myself the weakest cup of hotel room coffee known to mankind, and tried not to think about what Eleanor had whispered at the rehearsal just 48 hours earlier. "Enjoy this while it lasts. He'll regret choosing you." Her voice had etched itself into the base of my skull like graffiti, and no matter how many deep breaths I took, I could still hear it playing on repeat like some cursed lullaby. People think that revenge is this loud, dramatic thing, screaming matches, thrown drinks, storming out of rooms, but it's not. Real revenge is quiet, careful, deliberate. It's a needle in a wedding bouquet, a blade stitched into lace, a smile that hides the trapdoor underneath it. I hadn't told a soul what I was planning, not even my best friend Harper, who'd known me since college and could usually smell my schemes before I even breathed them into the world. I'd kept it locked inside, every word sharpened to a point, every sentence placed like a brick in a foundation that Eleanor herself had unknowingly helped build. When the hair and makeup teams arrived, the suite exploded into a circus of curling irons, lip gloss, laughter, and mimosa-fueled declarations of love and loyalty. The girls fussed over me, told me how gorgeous I looked, and asked me if I was nervous. I smiled, told them I felt amazing, told them I was ready. And in a way, I was ready not just to get married, but to take back every inch of power that woman had tried to steal from me over the past year. Right before I stepped into my dress, Eleanor appeared at the door like some Broadway villain who couldn't help but make one last entrance before the curtains rose. She wore this navy blue silk gown that probably cost more than my first car and had that expression on her face, the one where she looked like she'd just smelled something rotten and was too polite to say anything. She didn't say hello. She didn't congratulate me. She just stood there, arms crossed, and said, "Well, you made it this far." Harper, who was fixing my veil at the time, froze with her fingers still tangled in the tulle and blinked at Eleanor like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. One of the other girls let out this awkward little gasp that turned into a cough. I just shrugged and said, "She's charming like that," then turned back toward the mirror and pretended not to notice the way Eleanor's mouth tightened into a smug little line. She stayed there for another moment, long enough to make sure she'd been heard, and then left without another word. And I swear, the room felt lighter the second the door shut behind her. Dan was waiting at the venue with his groomsmen, all nervous smiles and cufflink fumbles, but something was off with him. I could tell the moment I saw him, even through the small window where the bridal suite overlooked the garden. He wasn't pacing or panicking, not visibly at least, but there was a tightness in his posture I hadn't seen before, like he was bracing for something or carrying a weight he couldn't talk about. When I finally asked him about it later, he told me Eleanor had pulled him aside that morning, right after breakfast, and kept him for over 20 minutes. When I asked what she said, he just looked away and muttered something about wedding nerves and family stress. But I knew whatever she'd said had burrowed its way under his skin and wrapped around his spine like ice. I wanted to ask him if she told him not to marry me. I wanted to ask if she'd begged him to walk away. But instead, I just kissed him and told him he looked handsome, because sometimes silence is louder than any accusation. The ceremony itself was beautiful, annoyingly perfect in that way that makes you wonder if it's the calm before a storm. The sun hit the stained glass at just the right angle, and the music started playing right on cue. I walked down the aisle, my heart pounding in my ears, my father squeezing my arm with trembling fingers, and every pair of eyes turned toward me except one. Eleanor didn't look at me once. She kept her gaze straight ahead, like if she acknowledged me in white, it would make it real. Dan smiled when he saw me. Not the forced smile of someone pretending, but the genuine, stupid, hard-eyed smile of a man in love. And for a second, just a brief second, I almost forgot what I was about to do. I almost let myself sink into the fantasy of it all, the dress, the vows, the promises we make in front of people who may or may not be rooting for us. But then Father Andrew cleared his throat, and my chest tightened like someone had yanked a string tied around my lungs. He began with the standard vows, the ones we'd written together weeks ago. We laughed. We cried. People sniffled. Then he paused. "There's a small addition requested by the bride," he said, his voice calm and even, but I caught the flicker in his eyes when he glanced at Eleanor. And in that silence, before he even opened his mouth, I saw her shift in her seat like she felt it too, the moment the floor begins to creak just before it gives way. And then he began to read. The moment the priest's voice changed, just slightly, like he'd tasted the spice in a dish that was supposed to be sweet, I saw it happen not on Dan's face, not on mine, but on hers. Eleanor sat 3 rows from the front, her shoulders squared like a soldier ready for combat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, that same rigid smile plastered across her lips like she'd superglued it there for the sake of appearances. But even glue cracks when the foundation shakes, and as Father Andrew read the first line of my special vow, her smile twitched, just once, but enough. It started gentle, familiar, like every other wedding vow you'd expect at a ceremony, with orchids strung from the ceiling and a harpist playing some overplayed classic in the background. I spoke about love, about building a life together, about the memories that got us to this point, and the faith I had in what came next. People smiled, people dabbed their eyes, people sighed in the way only a room full of romantics can. But then the rhythm changed. And to the woman who gave you life, Eleanor, I owe you thanks. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. You could feel it ripple through the guests, that subtle inhale of air that came from 50 different mouths all at once, as if no one was quite sure whether I'd just made a kind gesture or begun the slow draw of a blade. Not for your support, Father Andrew continued, pausing ever so slightly. Not for your love, but for reminding me, every step of the way, that I had to earn my place in this family, by surviving you. Someone near the front audibly gasped, the kind of startled breath you make when someone drops a glass in a silent room, and then the rest of the pews went stiff. Eleanor blinked, and for the first time in the entire year I'd known her, that smug expression slipped just enough to reveal the panic underneath. It wasn't terror. No, that would have been too human. It was disbelief. She didn't understand how this was happening, or more precisely, how she hadn't seen it coming. I wasn't done. I'll never be Marissa, the priest read on, with the same calm reverence he used when quoting scripture. I don't want to be, because Dan didn't choose her. He chose me. And if he regrets that one day, well, he'll regret it standing next to a woman who fought like hell to keep him despite your sabotage. A stunned silence fell over the entire garden. You could hear the leaves rustle, you could hear the faint hum of the caterer's equipment near the reception tent, you could hear someone at the back choke on a flute of champagne and drop their program onto the stone floor. And still, Eleanor didn't move. She sat there as if her spine had been frozen into the chair, as if standing would mean acknowledging what had just happened, and she was far too proud to ever give that satisfaction. Dan turned toward me slowly. His expression was unreadable, as if he was trying to do calculus in his head while the house burned down around him. What was that about? He asked, barely a whisper. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were on her. I leaned toward the mic and said, softly, clearly, ask your mom. The priest cleared his throat again, hesitated for the briefest of moments, God bless him, and then continued with the regular ceremony like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just read a verbal grenade into the middle of the happiest day of our lives. Dan's hands trembled slightly when he took mine again. His voice cracked just enough when he said, I do, but it still came out. I said it back without a blink. The crowd clapped because of course they did. It's what you're supposed to do when 2 people get married, even if the air feels thick enough to cut with a cake knife. I could see people murmuring, eyes darting between me and Eleanor like we were the final 2 in a reality show, and one of us had just pulled the ultimate power move. She didn't clap. She just sat there, blinking, still stuck on whatever script she'd written for the day that had clearly been shredded on live television. The reception happened like nothing was wrong. That's the funny part. People drank, people danced, people posed for photos pretending they hadn't just witnessed something unholy dressed up as a vow. Dan and I made our rounds, accepted the congratulations, smiled for the cameras. But the undercurrent was there, the shift in energy, the soft whispers behind champagne flutes, the subtle glances tossed across the tent like darts. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed and the buzz of celebration had finally dulled into something almost like quiet, Dan sat beside me on the hotel bed and stared at the floor for a long time. Then, without looking at me, he asked, "Did you plan that? To hurt her?" I didn't rush the answer. I didn't soften it. I looked at him and said no. I planned it so she'd remember I can speak, too. He didn't say anything after that. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He just sat there with his mouth slightly open like he was still trying to wrap his head around the fact that I had a voice sharp enough to cut through everything his mother had tried to build against me. And maybe he was wondering what else I'd been holding back. We danced one more time before bed, slow and tired and quiet, just the two of us and the hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of my dress against the carpet. I rested my head on his shoulder, and for a minute I let myself imagine we were fine, that the worst was behind us. But then I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the mirror across the room. And as we swayed to our first song, I realized something. I wasn't sure if I married the man of my dreams or the son of my nightmare.